Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 2. Betsy Holds the Reins. You can imagine, perhaps, the terror of Elizabeth Ann as the train carried her along toward Vermont and the horrible Putney farm. It had happened so quickly, her satchel packed, the telegram sent, the train caught, that she had not had time to get her wits together, assert herself, and say that she would not go there. Besides, she had a sinking notion that perhaps they wouldn't pay any attention to her if she did. The world had come to an end now that Aunt Frances wasn't there to take care of her. Even in the most familiar air, she could only half breathe without Aunt Frances. Now she was not even being taken to the Putney farm. She was being sent. She shrank in her seat, more and more frightened as the end of her journey came nearer, and looked out dismally at the winter landscape, thinking it hideous with its brown bare fields, its brown bare trees, and the quick-running little streams hurrying along, swollen with the January thaw which had taken all the snow from the hills. She had heard her elders say about her so many times that she could not stand the cold, that she shivered at the very thought of the cold weather, and certainly nothing could look colder than that bleak country into which the train was now slowly making its way. The engine puffed and puffed with great labouring breaths that shook Elizabeth Ann's diaphragm up and down, but the train moved more and more slowly. Elizabeth Ann could feel under her feet how the floor of the car was tipped up as it crept along the steep incline. "Pretty stiff grade here," said a passenger to the conductor. "You bet," he assented. "But Hillsborough is the next station, and that's at the top of the hill. We go down after that to Rutland." He turned to Elizabeth Ann. "Say, little girl, didn't your uncle say you were to get off at Hillsborough? You'd better be getting your things together." Poor Elizabeth Ann's knees knocked against each other with the fear of the strange faces she was to encounter, and when the conductor came to help her get off, he had to carry the white, trembling child as well as her satchel. But there was only one strange face there, not another soul in sight at the little wooden station. A grim-faced old man in a fur cap and heavy coat stood by a lumber wagon. "This is her, Mr. Putney," said the conductor, touching his cap, and went back to the train, which went away, shrieking for a nearby crossing and setting the echoes ringing from one mountain to another. There was Elizabeth Ann, alone with her much-feared great-uncle Henry. He nodded to her and drew out from the bottom of the wagon a warm, large cape, which he slipped over her shoulders. "The women folks were afraid you'd get cold driving," he explained. He then lifted her high to the seat, tossed her satchel into the wagon, climbed up himself, and clucked to his horses. Elizabeth Ann had always before thought it was an essential part of railway journeys to be much kissed at the end, and asked a great many times how you had stood the trip. She sat very still on the high lumber seat, feeling very forlorn and neglected. Her feet dangled high above the floor of the wagon. She felt herself to be in the most dangerous place she had ever dreamed of in her worst dreams. Oh, why wasn't Aunt Frances there to take care of her? It was just like one of her bad dreams. Yes, it was horrible. She would fall. She would roll under the wheels and be crushed to... She looked up at Uncle Henry with the wild eyes of nervous terror, which always brought Aunt Frances to her in a rush to hear all about it, to sympathize, to reassure. Uncle Henry looked down at her soberly, his hard, weather-beaten old face unmoved. "Here, you drive, will you, for a piece?" he said briefly, putting the reins into her hands, hooking his spectacles over his ears, and drawing out a stubby pencil and a bit of paper. "I've got some figuring to do. You pull on the left-hand rein to make him go to the left, and t'other way, though 'tain't likely we'll meet any teams." Elizabeth Ann had been so near one of her wild screams of terror that now, in spite of her instant absorbed interest in the reins, she gave a queer little yelp. She was all ready with the explanation, her conversations with Aunt Frances having made her very fluent in explanations of her own emotions. She would tell Uncle Henry about how scared she had been, and how she had just been about to scream, and couldn't keep back that one little... But Uncle Henry seemed not to have heard her little howl, or, if he had, didn't think it worth conversation, for the horses were certainly going to one side. She hastily decided which was her right hand, she had never been forced to know it so quickly before, and pulled on that rein. The horses turned their hanging heads a little, and miraculously there they were in the middle of the road again. Elizabeth Ann drew a long breath of relief and pride, and looked to Uncle Henry for praise, but he was busily setting down figures as though he was getting his arithmetic lesson for the next day, and had not noticed. Oh, there they were going to the left again. This time, in her flurry, she made a mistake about which hand was which, and pulled wildly on the left line. The horses docilely walked off the road into a shallow ditch. The wagon tilted. Help! Why didn't Uncle Henry help? Uncle Henry continued intently figuring on the back of his envelope. Elizabeth Ann, the perspiration starting out on her forehead, pulled on the other line. The horses turned back up the little slope. The wheel grated sickeningly against the wagon box. She was sure they would tip over. But there they were in the road, safe and sound, with Uncle Henry adding up a column of figures. If he only knew, thought the little girl, if he only knew the danger he had been in, and how he had been saved. But she must think of some way to remember for sure which her right hand was, and avoid that hideous mistake again. And then, suddenly something inside Elizabeth Ann's head stirred and moved. It came to her, like a clap, that she needn't know which was right or left. If she just pulled the way she wanted them to go, the horses would never know whether it was the right or the left rein. It is possible that what stirred inside her head at that moment was her brain waking up. She was 9 years old, and she was in the 3rd A grade at school. But that was the first time she had ever had a whole thought of her very own. At home, Aunt Frances had always known exactly what she was doing, and had helped her over the hard places before she even knew they were there, and at school her teachers had been carefully trained to think faster than the scholars. Somebody had always been explaining things to Elizabeth Ann so carefully that she had never found out a single thing for herself before. This was a very small discovery, but it was her own. Elizabeth Ann was as excited about it as a mother bird over the first egg that hatches. She forgot how afraid she was of Uncle Henry, and poured out to him her discovery. "It's not right or left that matters," she ended triumphantly. "It's which way you want to go." Uncle Henry looked at her attentively as she talked, eyeing her sidewise over the top of one spectacle glass. When she finished, "Well, now, that's so," he admitted, and returned to his arithmetic. It was a short remark, shorter than any Elizabeth Ann had ever heard before. Aunt Frances and her teachers always explained matters at length, but it had a weighty, satisfying ring to it. The little girl felt the importance of having her statement recognized. She turned back to her driving. The slow, heavy plow horses had stopped during her talk with Uncle Henry. They stood as still now as though their feet had grown to the road. Elizabeth Ann looked up at the old man for instructions, but he was deep in his figures. She had been taught never to interrupt people, so she sat still and waited for him to tell her what to do. But although they were driving in the midst of a winter thaw, it was a pretty cold day, with an icy wind blowing down the back of her neck. The early winter twilight was beginning to fall, and she felt rather empty. She grew tired of waiting, and remembered how the grocer's boy at home had started his horse. Then, summoning all her courage, with an uneasy glance at Uncle Henry's arithmetical silence, she slapped the reins up and down on the horses' backs and made the best imitation she could of the grocer's boy's cluck. The horses lifted their heads. They leaned forward. They put one foot before the other. They were off! The color rose hot on Elizabeth Ann's happy face. If she had started a big red automobile, she would not have been prouder, for it was the first thing she had ever done all herself, every bit, every smitch. She had thought of it, and she had done it, and it had worked! Now, for what seemed to her a long, long time, she drove so hard she could think of nothing else. She guided the horses around stones. She cheered them through freezing mud puddles of melted snow. She kept them in the anxiously exact middle of the road. She was quite astonished when Uncle Henry put his pencil and paper away, took the reins from her hands, and drove into a yard, on one side of which was a little low white house, and on the other a big red barn. He did not say a word, but she guessed that this was Putney Farm. 2 women in gingham dresses and white aprons came out of the house. One was old, and one might be called young, just like Aunt Harriet and Aunt Frances, but they looked very different from those aunts. The dark-haired one was very tall and strong-looking, and the white-haired one was very rosy and fat. They both looked up at the little thin, white-faced girl on the high seat and smiled. "Well, father, you got her, I see," said the brown-haired one. She stepped up to the wagon and held up her arms to the child. "Come on, Betsy, and get some supper," she said, as though Elizabeth Ann had lived there all her life and had just driven into town and back. And that was the arrival of Elizabeth Ann at Putney Farm.